Good evening, everyone, and thanks so much for joining us tonight for what I hope will be an important discussion addressing the unprecedented healthcare and economic crisis facing this country. What we're going to do tonight is I'm going to chat for a little bit about what's going on in Washington, what I think should be going on in Washington, and then we're going to bring on separately and then together three of the outstanding members of the United States Congress, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Ilhan Omar, and Rashida Tlaib. And they will speak separately, and then we'll engage in a discussion together. And I wanted to have them on this virtual town meeting. They represent different parts of the country, and I wanted to hear from them what's going on in their communities and where they think we should go as a country. We're also very appreciative tonight that we have a grandson who is going to provide some excellent quality music as we move the program along. This is, as I think everybody knows, a moment in American and world history that nobody alive has ever experienced. We're dealing with dual crises. We're dealing with a healthcare crisis in terms of the coronavirus, which is spreading all over our country, has spread all over the world, will kill many, many millions of people throughout the world. And we are dealing with an economic meltdown of enormous significance, impacting the world and impacting our own economy as well. And let me begin by saying to you that, my goal tonight is not to be partisan. I think the last thing that the American people want to be hearing is some kind of partisan attacks. Everybody is worried, everybody is concerned, and they want to know where we go from here. But I do have to say that I was really stunned to read aspects of the Republican bill that has been proposed. It's not going to go anyplace. I think the Democratic caucus will not accept it for a second. But it is hard for me to believe that in the midst of this terrible crisis, that we have a Senate Republican bill that would give the Trump administration a blank check to hand out corporate welfare to virtually any corporation in America without conditions as to how they can protect workers in this country. And that obviously is not going to happen, but that is what they're coming forward. And right now we have, again, unbelievable as it may seem, I am more than familiar with corporate greed and the power of lobbyists. But to think that at this moment, when we have doctors and nurses putting their lives on the line to protect the American people, you have corporate lobbyists who are working overtime in order to receive special benefits for their corporations. And let me just give you a few examples so you'll understand how vulgar some of what is going on is. We're hearing from the airline industry, which is admittedly hard hit. They want a $50 billion bailout, but they are not talking about how they're going to protect the workers in that industry. We're talking about, this is quite amazing, the private space industry. Remember, this is the midst of a coronavirus epidemic. The private space industry is requesting $5 billion to benefit people like Jeff Bezos and other billionaires. The candy industry, again, a crisis in which millions of people are going to get sick, many will die. The candy industry is online for a $500 million to benefit the likes of the Mars candy bar family. And, this is a family that is one of the wealthiest families in America, worked very hard to reduce taxes for the rich. They're in line. The hotel industry wants $150 billion. And by the way, one of the recipients of that bailout would be the Trump family. The National Association of Manufacturers, who in the past have shut down factories in America, moved to China, moved to Mexico, been at war with the working people in this country. They're online, man. They're there. Their lobbyists are there. They want $1.4 trillion in assistance. Obviously, that is just astounding to me, and I think the American people. Apparently, the greed of some of these people has no end. In my view, and I think the American people are united on this, we need policies now which benefit the working families of this country, that benefit low-income people, that benefit the most vulnerable. We're not here to give handouts to large corporate interests without any strings attached. Let me say a word about the healthcare crisis in terms of what we have got to do. One of the things that I find astounding is that, and it speaks volumes about the dysfunctionality and the absurdity of the current healthcare system. One might think that at a time when we are spending $11,000 for every man, woman, and child, twice as much as the people of any other country, one might think that we would be prepared for an epidemic in terms of making sure that our medical professionals, our doctors, our nurses, and other people who are in day-to-day contact with people struggling with the coronavirus, you might think that they would have the masks that they need, that they would have the gloves they need, that they would have the protective gowns they need in order to do their jobs. The truth is, as I think many of you know, they do not have that medical equipment. And right now, we are seeing in this country and around the world, medical professionals getting sick because of their exposure to the coronavirus. And this is not only a tragedy for the doctors and the nurses and the other medical profession, it is a very frightening situation for our whole country. Because if our frontline doctors and nurses go down and are unable to provide the care we desperately need at this moment, who is going to be there to protect the millions of people who are sick? So what we have got to do right now is to understand that at this moment, the President of the United States has got to fully utilize in an extremely aggressive way the Defense Production Act. And what the Defense Production Act states is that the president has a right to tell a private company, you know what, instead of manufacturing T-shirts or underwear or socks, not exactly what we need right now in the midst of this crisis, you will start production in terms of masks, in terms of gowns, in terms of gloves, in terms of the other equipment that our medical professionals need. Now, the good news is some in the private sector, some companies are already making that transformation, and I applaud them. And these companies deserve to be adequately compensated for the work that they're doing. But what we need is at a time when experts estimate that the United States alone, I'm not talking about the rest of the world, our country alone, may need a minimum of hundreds of millions of masks, because they are disposable. You don't reuse them. You should not reuse them. Of masks and gloves and gowns in order to get through this pandemic. What the President of the United States must tell various companies is, you're going to stop producing what you're producing today. We need you to produce the products that our doctors and nurses and medical personnel needs. In addition to making sure that our physicians and nurses have the protective equipment they need to protect their own lives so that they can continue protecting the American people, Trump must order the immediate production of ventilators, ICU units, test kits, and the agents needed to process those tests. We are woefully behind in all of those areas. There are apparently tests now being developed which can give results in less than an hour. And that is enormously important, because what we don't want to do is have hospital beds filled up with people who do not have the coronavirus. We want to make sure that those beds are there for the people who need them. And rapid processing of these tests is terribly important. So on an emergency basis, we've got to get these tests done, we've got to get the processes done, and we need to move on this as aggressively as we can. Furthermore, we must increase the availability of mobile medical units. That means if hospitals don't have the beds that they need, the ICU units they need, there should be units placed alongside the hospitals, and I suspect that the Department of Defense and the Veterans Administration can play an important role in that process. Bottom line is that we are facing an unprecedented medical crisis. We need an unprecedented medical response, and the president has got to utilize all of the tools that he has in order to protect the American people. Second issue I want to say a few words on before we bring on the Congresswomen, and that is to talk about the economic impact of the epidemic we are experiencing. Nobody, of course, can predict what the economic fallout of the epidemic is, but we all know that it's going to be very, very severe. There have been estimates out there that within a few months, unemployment in this country might be as high as 20%. There was an estimate coming from the Federal Reserve in St. Louis suggesting that by June, the unemployment rate may be even 30%. And that is on top of the reality that the stock market has suffered massive losses, which means many, many Americans are worried about what their retirement will look like with these losses. All of this suggests that what we may, and hopefully we're wrong, nobody knows, but worst case scenario, we are looking at the worst economic downturn since the 1930s. And in the midst of not only this healthcare crisis, but the economic downturn, the United States Congress and the President of the United States must act in an unprecedented way, and in a way that meets the needs of the working families, the middle class, the lower income people in this country, the most vulnerable people in this country. Our job right now, and this is stuff, we have no history for doing this, but this is what we've got to do now. We've got to make everybody in this country feel confident that they will be protected as this crisis unfolds. And let me just give you an example of the kind of problems that we are dealing with. Let me just quote from an article that appeared in the Washington Post this afternoon. Quote, since Nicole Kane lost her job as a Haas's Steak and Sea House waitress Monday because of the spread of the coronavirus, all she can think about is April 1st, when her mortgage and car payments are due. Kane's husband works at Panera, which is still open for takeout in their small town of Lebanon, Pennsylvania, but business has been slow, making the couple fearful for his job as well. The family has 3 children and 2 car loans, end of quote. Suspending mortgage and car payments for 3 months would be the biggest impact for my life, Kane said, end of quote again. So here you have a family, a wife lost her job, husband may lose his job. They got a mortgage payment coming up on April 1st, and they have car payments on 2 cars. That is their reality. And what happens if they have no income? What happens? Are they going to be able to keep their house? And that's just one example. There are millions of examples. Last night, 2 nights ago, we talked to a representative of the restaurant workers organizing effort. And she was talking about millions of workers who are living on tips. They're making $2 or $3 an hour on tips, on salary, on wages, and then they get tips on top of that. These people have nothing in the bank. What happens when they lose their job? What happens to millions of people? The 40% of American people do not have $400 in the bank for an emergency. So you got half of our country living paycheck to paycheck, and now suddenly those paychecks stop. How are they going to feed their families? How are they going to keep their telephones? How are they going to keep their lights on? What happens if their kid gets sick? How do they get to a doctor? So there is enormous economic anxiety taking place all across this country. Let me just very briefly touch upon what other countries are doing in response to the crisis. In the United Kingdom, in Germany, in Denmark, and in Norway, these countries are moving aggressively to guarantee 75, 80%, and in some cases 100% of the paychecks of workers in businesses that commit to not laying off employees. In other words, in one of those countries, if an employer says, okay, we're going to keep you on the payroll, the government is guaranteeing between 80% and 100% of that paycheck. And in my view, that is exactly what we should be doing in this country right now. Is that a radical statement? Of course it is. But these are unprecedented times, and we must spend whatever it takes to make sure that every family in America is made whole, is not made desperate by this crisis. And so it is my view that workers who are unemployed, regardless of their previous eligibility for unemployment, and that's an important point because right now, unbelievably, most workers are not covered by unemployment compensation. And we got to throw that out of the door and make sure that every worker, whether you're driving an Uber car, whether you are a waitress, whether you're a waiter, whether you're a so-called independent contractor, every worker in America needs to know that he or she is going to be able to retain their income up to at least $75,000 a year. In addition to that, we need to provide $2,000 monthly, every month, payment to every man, woman, and child in America until the crisis ends. I know some of my Republican colleagues are talking about, gee, a one-time $1,000 payment. Really? Really? Yeah, that'll last you for 2 or 3 weeks. And what happens after that? Once again, in this unprecedented moment in American history, we must act in an unprecedented way, no matter what it costs. And that means to guarantee to every man, woman, and child in this country that we will make them whole, that we're not going to leave them out hanging, losing their homes, getting evicted from their apartments, losing their ability to communicate. Furthermore, we need to make sure that every worker in America has paid family and medical leave, not just the 20% of workers who are currently have that benefit. Again, we are the only major country not to guarantee paid family and medical leave. That is beyond pathetic. And in this crisis, we have to make sure that workers do not go to work when they are sick because they are fearful of losing that paycheck. That is insane, and that is something that has to be done right now. Furthermore, we must make sure that the measures that I'm talking about apply to everyone in this country, regardless of immigration status, and they must apply equally to tribal and territorial communities as well. That means Puerto Rico, that means our other territories, that means those people who are undocumented. This is not the time to play stupid games. We are all in this together. In my view, on top of what I have just said, I worry very much about this crisis' impact on the healthcare benefits of ordinary Americans. Now, everybody knows that I am a strong advocate for Medicare for all. I think we've got to join every other country on earth in guaranteeing healthcare to all people. But right now, at the very least, what we should be doing is saying to those workers, the millions of workers who are losing their jobs, you know what, relax. You and your family are going to have health care. We're going to expand Medicare to cover you. Now, that means changes in Medicare because Medicare now does not cover the needs of children. It's not pediatric care. We have to change that. But I want every worker in America to understand that he or she and their families will be covered when they lose their jobs. And on top of that, if you have private insurance right now, you got a $5,000 deductible. We should have Medicare covering those needs so that you do not have to pay out-of-pocket expenses. Furthermore, we need to protect states and cities right now because tax revenue is plummeting. We are seeing states and cities who may not be able to make their payrolls in several weeks. And that is a disaster for the municipal and state employees, but it is also a disaster for everybody because these state and municipal workers are the people who are providing the services that we need in the midst of this crisis. So there must be a significant amount of money going to the states and the cities, and one approach is to have the Federal Reserve act aggressively and forcefully to buy short-term municipal debt securities. And this will help stabilize state government finances and provide states and cities with the financial support they need to address the health and economic crisis. Furthermore, and again, I'm only giving you an outline of some of the basics here. I mean, we can go on for hour after hour after hour dealing with all that has to be done in this crisis, which is impacting every single one of us in this country. We have got to be mindful of the most vulnerable people in this country. Right now, there are elderly people who are sitting home alone and they're worried. How are they going to get the food that they need? How are our people going to make sure that all of us have the nutrition, the housing, the clean water, the electricity, and the basic necessities of life that we all need to get through this pandemic? So that means, among many other things, expanding the Meals on Wheels program, which delivers meals to elderly people. It means expanding the school meals program. If kids are not in school now, how are they going to get the nutrition they need? We got to make sure that the kids are adequately fed in this crisis. It means expanding the SNAP program. Bottom line here, it means that in the richest country in the history of the world, in this crisis, nobody in America goes hungry. And I'm talking about the homeless, I'm talking about the disabled, I'm talking about everybody in this country. Furthermore, what it means is putting an immediate moratorium on evictions, on foreclosures, and utility shutoffs, and suspending payments on rent and mortgage loans for primary residences. It means also restoring utility services to any customers who have had their utility shut off. I think later on in this program, Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib of Detroit is going to be talking about the insane situation in Detroit, where you got thousands and thousands of households who have no running water. Yeah, in America, all over this country, there are people who do not have running water, and we're telling everybody, wash your hands 10 times a day. We got to make sure that everybody in America has basic utility service. Furthermore, I worry very much that we have a prison system in this country, state prisons, which are already disasters. We have heard the horrible things happening. There is a fear that if we don't get our act together, we could see the coronavirus spread in those prisons. We got to make sure that we are protecting those people. And we also have to make sure that we are protecting the homeless. Last point that I want to make before I introduce our guests is that we have got to do everything we can to stop the profiteering that some corporate interests are now engaged in. There are reports that the cost of rubber gloves is now soaring because people understand there's an enormous demand for them. They can charge any price they want. My good friends in the pharmaceutical industry, which is probably the most corrupt industry to begin with, are already seeing how they can make more profits right now in the midst of this crisis. So the word has got to go out. And if Trump can't do it, and I doubt that he can, Congress must do it. and say that right now, when we have doctors and nurses, when we have police officers, when we have EMT people putting their lives on the line, when we have teachers doing everything they can to make sure that our kids continue to get the education they need, when we're seeing the best in human nature, millions of people doing the right thing in this crisis, we will not accept profiteering and greed and corporations and individuals trying to rip off people in the midst of this crisis. Not acceptable. And I don't think Trump can do the right thing on this, but Congress must do the right thing. And we must be very loud and clear on that. So let me just conclude by thanking everybody for being with us. And what we're going to do right now, because I think it's a good thing to do, but because of the technological limitations we're under here, we're going to hear some music from the artist Grandson. We thank Grandson very much for helping us out tonight. And after we hear from Grandson, we're going to come back and we're going to hear from Congresswoman. I believe the first one we're going to hear from is Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Then we'll hear from Ilhan Omar from Minnesota, and then Rashida Tlaib from Michigan. I think that's the order. It may be changed, but that's what I would like to do. So let's now hear from Grandson for a few minutes, and then we'll be back with Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. And then after each of the members of Congress speak, we're going to open it up for a discussion. So thanks very much for being with us. Now we'll hear from Grandson.